Before we get started, I just want to let you know about a couple upcoming programs. First, we have our 2025 Community Day Symposium, Awakening Mythic Wisdom for Individual and Community Renewal, with Robert Tyminski, Laura Monchot, and Diane Sherwood, all Jungian analysts. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you might remember a recent episode with Robert Tyminski. And so he's going to be joining us for our Community Day. It's on March 8th at Loyola University, and it will be recorded. So if you can't make it in person, you'll be able to purchase the video after it's been edited. Also, we have a short webinar series, Facing Uncertainty, a depth psychological perspective on manipulation and conspiracy theories during turbulent times with Vlado Schultz, Jungian Analyst, on February 27th and March 6th. For more information, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung in the World, a podcast of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. I'm honored today to have James Hollis on the podcast. A Jungian analyst, he has written 20 books and over 50 articles. He was a professor of the humanities for 26 years before retraining at the C.G. Jung Institute of Zurich. He served as executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston, Texas for many years and was the executive director of the Jung Society of Washington, D.C. in 2019. He's a retired senior training analyst for the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, was the first training director at the Philadelphia Jung Institute, and is vice president emeritus of the Philemon Foundation. Additionally, he's a professor of Jungian studies at Saybrook University. Welcome, James Hollis. What an honor to have you on Jung in the World.
Well, thank you, Patricia. It's fine to be with you. Thank you very much.
So given the depth and breadth of your career, I want to talk with you today about the theme that threads through a lot of your writing, which is what it means to grow up. But I need to credit one of the interns who supports this podcast. I asked her during our interview what she wanted to learn this summer. And she said, I want to learn what it means to grow up, 20 years old. And I took that to heart. So we divvied up your body of work and people came forward with questions and quotes. And so this is going to be kind of a mixtape of James Hollis talking about adulting. And we're thrilled. So you have written things about growing up that are written with both compassion and urgency about our need to individuate. Here's one of the quotes that came forward. Quote, as children, we have a right to look to others to care for us. Sometimes we get that, sometimes we do not. Either way, we all have to grow up, relinquish the search for the good parent in others, and stop whining. That was a quote that one of the young people put forward to me as like, yeah, ask him about this.
Well, I think that pretty much speaks for itself. It's easy to whine, but ultimately the bottom line is a grown-up is a person who is accountable for his or her own choices and their consequences. And the truth is, the more we get into this, the more we realize a lot of our choices are coming out of unconscious places. And the problem with the unconscious is it is unconscious. So we often look back upon previous life choices and think, what was I thinking when I did that? And what was that about? And where did that come from in me? But I think most of all, it's about being accountable. We need to be accountable for our choices and their consequences, but also accountable for our own lives. We all have dependency needs. That's part of being human. But when they prevail, they impose them on other people, which is not another very caring thing to do. For example, how many times are children carrying the esteem needs of the parent? The parent is wanting the child to make them feel good about themselves, for example. Or how often do we unwittingly sabotage our intimate relationships by expecting the other to make us feel good about ourselves or to take care of business for ourselves? And We all have appointments with adulthood, and a lot of people will put off that appointment as long as they can get away with it. So it's not wrong to have dependency needs. It's wrong to have them prevail in our relationships, and therein lies the distinction. And one needs to be mindful of where our neediness shows up in life and take on these projects for ourselves. And when we do that, we are being accountable, and we are acting as if we were an adult after all.
I think the thing that strikes me about that quote is you point out something that I think is unconscious for many people, including myself, to relinquish the search for the good parent in other people. And I think we operate like that.
Yes, that's why I subtitled the Eden Project, which is about the search for the magical other, that person who's going to fix my life for me, that person who's going to cover the bases for me. That's going to, if I'm really lucky, I can avoid growing up because they're going to take care of things, you see.
Yes, they will mother me or father me, and then I don't have to grow up.
There you go. That's exactly right. And I think it's pretty universal. Ever since the exclusion from Eden, metaphorically speaking, there is a desire to go back into that safe and innocent place or that unconscious place. And every time we do that, we undermine our adult capacity and our adult responsibility. So in the bottom line is, at the end of this journey, we have to look back and say, no matter what happened to me as a result of fate or the choices of others, I'm accountable for what spills into the world through me, and I am accountable for their consequences. And what I don't face and what I don't address will be burdening someone else, such as our children, for example.
I want to ask you right at the top here how you came to the work of Carl Jung, because you had been a professor, an academic. Can you describe that moment when you decided I need to change my life?
Well, I think it was more in stages. Initially, as an academic, and I can consider myself a recovering academic. And the reason is I used academia, and I love teaching. I haven't stopped loving teaching. That's why you and I are talking today. But I think I used academia as a way of trying to transcend a turbulent childhood, emotional issues that were omnipresent in my life, and, if you will, rise above them. But and I did appreciate, for intellectual reasons, Jung's analysis of modern culture. I appreciated that he respected the life of the spirit. I appreciated his recognition that the most important things in life can only be expressed symbolically. All of that was very intriguing and compelling. But I was also privileged, though I didn't think so at the time, at midlife to have, on a personal level, a very serious depression. And it was at that point that I had to ask myself, and this question didn't come to me initially. The first question comes to one's mind is, how quickly did I get rid of this and get back to ordinary life? And the psyche had its own intention. And it's what took me, reluctantly, I would say, into the first hour of my own analysis in Philadelphia many years ago. And as I began to go deeper and deeper, I realized I was just dwelling on the surface, that learning had been useful and helpful, and I still draw upon it, but it also was missing some of those determinatives that were at work in the unconscious. And again, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So I realized I was going to have to go much deeper than I had ever planned. It was not just about, symptom alleviation. It was about trying to figure out what's really going on in here, what needs to be addressed, and where is this coming from? There's a question I often ask individuals in therapy today about any choice they've made. Now, the real issue is not so much what you did or didn't do or what you believe or don't believe, but what is that really in service to inside of you? And you can't particularly trust your first answer because often it's a complex at work or it's a fear-based response. And we need to sort of ferret that out and begin to discern, but what's really going on here? What is that choice you're making or that pattern you're reinforcing? What is that really servicing in your life? And is it helpful to you, or is it ultimately harmful? Is it enlarging your journey, or is it diminishing your journey? Those are kinds of questions that don't normally occur to us because we're swept along by the powers that are emanating from within us, and we serve those choices.
It seems to me that that is another tenet of yours about what it means to grow up, is that there is a quality to one's questions that go deeper, and they are somewhat expansive, meaning you're not asking a surface yes or no.
That's right.
And so I'm wondering if you have, over the years, as a Jungian analyst in private practice, have you found that there is a question that is a turn, it turns the key, or a couple of questions that have the qualities of expanding the person who's struggling?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I just mentioned two, and I'll repeat that. Number one is, what is this really in service to inside of you? And you're right. You have to recognize your first response is probably going to be the rationalization. Well, I did this because you said this or that, or you failed to do this or that. It's an external source I'm looking to. I really need to ask the question, what does that hit in me? What part of my history has activated here? And secondly, when you come to significant life choices, to ask this very heuristic question, does this pathway enlarge me or does it diminish me? Enlarge me in the sense I might be frightened to take the next step, but I also know it's in service to living a larger journey, psychologically speaking. We usually know the answer to that question. And if we don't, if you keep asking it through a process of discernment, it'll come to us. And we have to choose the path of enlargement. I've actually said to people, it sounds horribly simplistic, but there's some element of truth to this. In life, you have to choose between anxiety and depression. Because if you step into a larger journey, and remember, Jung said we all walk at shoes too small for us. We stay within our coping adaptations, understandably, because they were once protective. But later in life, they bind us to those earlier traumatic experiences or those early messages. And an enlarging journey is one where I have to take on more, which may cause my system to feel anxious about the unknown, because the ego's invested in management, in control. And every time you step into the new, you have to relinquish some of that fantasy of control. On the other hand, if you're not living an enlarging journey, then you're going to have depression because there's something in the psyche that's being violated, something that's going unheard, something that's unattended. And nature won't be mocked. It'll show up in our behaviors. It'll show up in troubling dreams. It'll show up in somatic disorders. It'll show up in our children. So this is not about narcissism or self-absorption. It's about becoming conscious. And when we're conscious, it won't always be pretty, but at least we have greater clarity as to what's going on within each of us and why we make certain choices or run from other choices.
When you talked about having to make the choice between anxiety and depression, it reminded me of something else that you said, that is, depression is pathological grieving. And when I look out at the rates of depression in America, depression has gone up 52%. It seems as a collective, we're grieving something. What are we grieving?
Well, I think at many levels, we have to address that question. I think we're grieving, although it's unconscious in many people, grieving the disconnect we have from nature. We're grieving the pollution crisis, the global warming issues, which threaten our very existence. I think we're grieving the fantasies that we had about our culture, the fantasies we had about ourselves. We're grieving choices made or not made, as the case may be. Grieving comes from the same Latin root gravis from which we get gravity. It's something that weighs heavily upon the spirit. And, you know, there are many things to grieve, and we can address some of them in a proactive way, and sometimes we simply have to live with them. We also have to grieve the fact that so many injustices occur in our world, where there's so much violence and so much neglect and so forth. I grieve that. I grieve that consciously. It will sound very strange, but it's factual. When I was a child, World War II was going on, and I grew up in Illinois, by the way, in Springfield, and I was as safe as any child could be on the planet. There are many, many more children not safe, but I was acutely aware of the suffering in the world, that people were being killed, that people were suffering. And I used to go on the street corner and by myself, it was a little ritual I had as a child, and sing these songs that were bespeaking the tensions and the losses going on, the stresses of the time. Now, that may sound like a weird kid, but I think basically what I was saying was I was tuned in to people's emotional life. And maybe it's no surprise later in life that I wound up as a therapist. But to me, it was something that was of sufficient gravitas that it bore acknowledgement. And I did that as a child. And I don't think that's ever gone away from me. Although, as I mentioned, I think I tried to compensate for that in a personal way by entering the intellectual life as a kind of defense against the magnitude of those feelings that I was carrying within.
That's so interesting. I recall you also saying about depression that it is the autonomous withdrawal of support from the soul. And I want to look at the flip side of that. When we are walking, individuating, we're walking a path, and the soul is in support of that direction. You got early inklings as a boy that you were sensitive in this way. So when you began to walk that path, what does it feel like when the soul is in support?
Well, I think when we're doing what is right for our soul, and remember, that's the literal translation of the Greek word psyche. So when I talk about psyche, we're talking about this agency within us that is meaning seeking and meaning creating and suffers the disconnect from meaning. And I think most human psychopathology comes out of the expression of the suffering of the soul. But when we're in harmony with that, we just have a sense of well-being. It doesn't mean our life is easy. Most of the people that we would admire in history were people who had very troubled lives, often ended in martyrdom. But what we valued about them, and continue to value perhaps, is that they had a certain fidelity to the summons of their own soul, for the integrity of their own journey. And they lived that through. It wasn't about being comfortable. It wasn't about having a good time, which is why I often say happiness isn't the goal, though our popular culture constantly says it is, because happiness is contextual and transitory. Happiness rises out of those moments when we are in relationship with our own soul. And when we're out of relationship with our own soul, it'll show up in the fact that we're doing all the right things, but the feeling is not supportive there. There's something missing, and we know it. Our energy systems are fully charged when we're doing what's right for us. Our dreams support us, or they oppose us, as the case may be. And most of all, as Jung put it, he said, the smallest of things with meaning is always larger than the largest of things without meaning. I mean, speak about our culture, where more is always better. The latest shiny thing is where one's to be spending one's energy and one's resources. And if that produced happiness, we'd know it. In fact, it creates an addictive culture where we need more and more and more. So this is not about being preachy on this subject. We're just being very pragmatic here. It's what really connects you in a meaningful way. I couldn't have imagined as a child that I would spend a good part of my adult life listening to the suffering of other people. But I also can't imagine anything that's more honorific than being invited to share the journey that other people have. And also to realize that in that human exchange, because it's a two-way dialogue, I continue to grow and learn from other people, And so it's part of the learning and teaching cycle that has always been of great importance for me as a child. And this is just doing it perhaps in a somewhat different arena.
I wondered about that, about what it's like to have James Hollis as my analyst. And I think one of the questions that came to me as I was imagining that, because you have quite a lot to bring to the table as an analyst, is, do you get the sense after all these many years of serving other people and listening to their hardships that when someone enters your consulting room, do you have a sense within the first few minutes that, yes, this is someone that I can truly help? I can truly help them navigate their lives?
Well, it's a good question, and I'd like to actually ignore that question for a moment and reframe it. I had a colleague once in New Jersey who said, usually in the first hour, she said, I can tell if the person I'm meeting is a big kid or a little kid. And I thought it was a very interesting distinction she was making. A big kid is a person who is able and willing to take on that responsibility for their life that we were referencing earlier today. And a little kid was wanting you to tell them what to do with their life. And the prospects for genuine growth and development is not as hopeful for the latter category there, because they're really wanting to replicate the parental figure. And that's, again, not a crime to do that. It simply stands in the way of realizing that what is true for us is to be found within us. In other words, there's something in each of us that knows us better than we know ourselves and has our best interests at heart. Not necessarily that we fit in or that we live a life free of conflict or suffering. That's a different pathway of life that's outside of our control. It's rather, is the way I'm living my journey supported by that deep sense of purposefulness, that agency within that knows us that well? Or is it opposed to that? And, many times you see people so owned by some early message or some complex that is so controlling and domineering in their life that they probably can't get through that or get out of that. In other cases, you can work it through. Jung put it very simply in a letter in the 1950s. He said the work of individuation consists of three parts, and psychology only helps with the first part, which is to give us insight. He said, then come the moral qualities of the individual. Second is the courage to face what needs to be faced. And thirdly is endurance, sticking it out over time till you live your way in to a larger journey, psychologically speaking. And that's not something you can model it for people, but you can't give it to them. They have to find that within them.
That's a longer haul. And I think we have been seduced in the culture to believing in instant gratification and instant results. And if I just do this one thing, if I could just hack my life and do these top 5 things, I would find myself on a new path and a new direction. And you're advocating for genuine growth here, slow over time.
Yes. Yeah, it's certainly true that there are moments in our life when we are making large choices of path A or path B. That's certainly the case. Do you marry this person? Do you take on that career? Do you live in this geography? What those choices are often large in their consequences. But the larger choices still, as I said before, is where is that coming from in me? And is this psychologically, psychospiritually enlarging to me? And, it's hard to know that at times. You could have a higher paycheck, let's say, somewhere. You might win someone's approval. in some pathway, but it's not necessarily right for you. So the question is, what is right for you? And then there are those hard times we come to, despite our best intentions, where we have to ask still another kind of question is, how now am I to live my life in the face of these circumstances over which I may have no outer control? I mentioned before we started our formal conversation today that I spent the last few years in some significant health crises, question about whether I was going to live or not, let alone be able to walk. And so the question then is, how now am I to live my life in the face of these medical circumstances? And that's a developmental question that calls you to accountability once again, rather than say, well, how quickly does this go away? Because sometimes things don't go away. It's like, what changes of attitude, behavior, frames of reference are needed now to deal with this? Aging itself or losses in our outer life. These are other signal moments in one's life. I mean, I have at the moment several people who've lost their life partner, and they are obliged to recognize maybe areas of their life they hadn't thought about, but which were carried by that other person, and now that all falls back upon them, or to cope with being alone and living a generative life rather than simply a passive and depressed life. Again, sooner or later, life takes us to places that we hadn't planned on going. And there's always a task there, the addressing of which can lead us out of a sense of victimage into a more active engagement. You might not be able to recover the old value, whatever it may be, but you play a proactive role in the conduct of your life rather than simply passively suffering it. So again, that calls for a certain measure of courage and a certain measure of accountability in one's life. And nobody can give that to us. We have to find that for ourselves.
I want to hover for a moment on that idea that at the bottom of every depression, one will find a task. And when one addresses it, life can move in a new direction. I think about the depressions that I've suffered, and in talking to other people, depression is a murky space. It's very hard to get clarity about the task. Do you have more to say about that? Can you share with us this business of identifying the task?
Well, first of all, is that psychological attitude I just referenced, and that is to stop feeling like a victim, even if it's occurred outside of our control, but to say, what am I called to address here? What am I called to do with my life? Maybe with reduced circumstances or capacities. And that still moves one again from being a victim, which only feeds the depression, into an active engagement with it. But also to say, all right, how and in what way do I need to reframe my sense of life at this stage of this journey? Sometimes we can't restore the old. We have to move forward. I've had the experience of losing a child, for example. I've had the experience of dealing with life-threatening illnesses, as have many other people. And, you pick yourself up off the floor and you show up tomorrow in the best way you can. I in one of the books, mentioned a de facto motto I have. It's not a very cheery motto. It's very simple. Shut up, suit up, show up. Look, there are people who have real life problems. Their children are being murdered. They don't have a roof over their head. They don't have enough to eat. You don't have problems compared to those poor souls. So just stop whining. Secondly, suit up means, metaphorically, do your homework, work hard. You want to do something different with your life? You want to change? Well, go about doing it. Don't expect it to fall out of the sky. Earn it. Thirdly, just do the best you can. All of us wind up screwing up here and there in life, making mistakes. Welcome to the club. Just show up, do the best you can, and be at peace with that. So it sounds very simplistic, but it's a call to, once again, accountability, isn't it? Shut up, suit up, show up.
I love it. Well, the thing is that this all hovers around your take on what we should make the goal of our lives. And this is a universal archetypal idea. You're not a big happiness guy. However, the culture right now loves happiness and the science of happiness. And happiness is one of those words that, the value is obvious, right? Oh, happiness is good. Who doesn't love being happy? But you're the goal you state across all these many books is consistent, that the goal of life isn't happiness, it's meaning. So I'm going to ask you a question that should seem obvious, but it's not, or I wouldn't ask it. What's in it for us to seek meaning? What does meaning give us in life?
Well, it's not that we seek meaning as much as meaning arises out of the journey that we have that is seeking something. In other words, I don't want to be opaque about that. But just to back off a moment, as I mentioned before, happiness is contextual. It's of a particular moment. It's not a permanent state. If you're very, very thirsty and you're in the desert, a glass of water will make you happy. Too much water, you drown in it. You see, so much of it's contextual. Secondly, it's transient because whatever feels wonderful today and makes me happy is tomorrow perhaps going to be surpassed by something else altogether. Meaning is not something we create. It's something that rises out of us as we experience being here. I've always loved learning. I continue to do so. As I said, once I identified that predominantly with academia, but there are all kinds of learning to go on, sensate learning, emotional learning, and so forth. But in the long run, if something is right for you, you experience it in a way that energizes you. And if it isn't for you, no matter how enthusiastic people around you might be or what your parents wanted for you, my parents were wonderful working class people. But their advice to me basically was to get a job at Bell Telephone, which was a perfectly fine place to work. But their whole vision for me was security at all cases and of all, at all costs. We'll always need telephones. It's a company where you don't have to work in the factory where my father did with shards of flying metal and a very dangerous environment, literally dangerous. And you can have a decent life in life. And this was good advice from the lessons that they had learned from their life. And I don't judge that in any way whatsoever, but I also knew I had to learn to leave and to learn what I could on the road, so to speak. And did I do it with confidence? No, I did it with dread. I did it with anxiety, but it also felt inwardly necessary. This life has to mean something to me on terms that make sense inside of me. That's why someone else can't give it to us per se. For example, I would say possibly the most wonderful thing I've ever known is being a parent, being capable of loving these little creatures. And at the same time, the day they're born, you start worrying about them. It's like, here's somebody else you have to worry about, right? So if you're a parent, it's good news and bad news, but it's also so meaningful and so rich that I can't imagine my life not having had them as part of my journey. The same with loving someone. To love someone is to commit yourself to them with the best of intentions, knowing that you'll lose them or they'll lose you. And if you want to protect yourself from them, you don't love anyone, price of love is cost, attachment and loss, the great rhythm of nature. And to flee that, I think, is to live a diminished life, because life involves that kind of risk.
Well, you talk about the idea of a shipwreck. And in adult life, there will be shipwrecks.
Absolutely.
And to try to steer around them means that you might lose access to one of the great treasures of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that what we're talking about here?
Sure. Many times people have said, but the best of intentions, how do I spare my children from the shipwrecks, from the midlife crisis or whatever is going to happen? The answer is you can't. Give them, if you can, a positive sense of themselves by the way you affirm them and treat them, but also give them a model. Jung said this, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. So live your journey as best you can. That inspires them, gives them an opening door to live their journey. And then you stand back and you hope for the best, because to hover around them and to in some way be trying to, I mean, I remember one of the first thoughts I had when my daughter was born and I was present was, well, my role here is to sort of lead the blocking, like a blocking pack coming out of the backfield, for the Bears or something, and spare her the obstacles of life. Well, but that's foolish. That was nonetheless my fantasy, was my thought. Well, yeah, but as soon as she steps out of the cradle, so to speak, she's on her own and she has her journey to live, and I can't spare that, and I can't, and I shouldn't. So again, we have to leave home in order to find ourselves. And I don't mean geographically as much as I mean psychospiritually. Each of us is different, to say the obvious. No one in history is equal or been like you. You can share experiences with other people, but you're a unique combination. And your accountability to life is to enter it as fully as you can and provide that small, tiny chip that we are in a sort of the great mosaic of being. If we don't do that, then why have we been here? Are we here to be taxpayers? Are we here to occupy space and time and suck up oxygen? No, we're here to become what life asks of us. I mean, I think the human psyche has two basic agendas. One is self-healing. So there's always a self-corrective system going on here, but it's also seeking its own expression through us. The human ego is not the boss. It's the vehicle through whom that energy is seeking to enter the world. And so we can stand in its way, we can sabotage it. But in the end, we're not serving life by not stepping into what life is calling us for. To choose a literal example, if a person has a certain interest or talent or calling, and they are too timid to take it on with whatever its costs may be, then in some way they've violated some larger energy than simply fitting in. As children, we overlearn the message. You're tiny, you're small, the world's big, and you're not. Now, how do you fit into all of this? Well, that's understandable. At the same time, that message overlearned means that we live a too cautious, a too timid a life, and unwittingly sabotage that of which we are capable.
It's so easy to do, because when we're being expanded, we've made choices, we've asked ourselves questions that expand us, we've made choices that expand us, then it also opens us to overwhelm. There's a yin and yang to this. And so I want to talk a little bit about overwhelm, because you identify it in a couple of your books as being, one of the maladies almost that comes out of a more existential neurosis. And so we live in a time when people are walking around entirely overwhelmed. We're consuming media and we're producing media ourselves. We're divvying up our personas across platforms. We're living in times where overwhelm, it seems to be like a daily drink of water. And so I'm really curious what you have to say currently about our state of overwhelm and how people can navigate it better.
Well, it reminds me of the ancient saying, to be in this world but not of it. There's a distinction there. I think it's wrong to live a life in flight from the world as it is, although I respect those who live lives of contemplation and so forth. I think we need to be engaged in the way in which it's important for us to be engaged, not because somebody else has done it, but also to protect ourselves. and to be able to say no and to find boundaries. There's a big difference between information and knowledge and wisdom. We're drowning in information. We live in the information age. Most of human history was spent in agriculture or finding, enough food to survive with. And then in the 19th century, it shifted to the mechanics of building things, and factories were the temples. And in the 20th century, it shifted to, social services, healthcare and education and so forth. Today, it's what? Information processing, and the computer is our new temple, so to speak. And we're drowning in information, but that doesn't equal knowledge. The information has to be collated and to figure out what's important, what's not important, and to critique it and to be, in an honest way, skeptical of it. And fourthly, to figure out, wisdom is about knowing, what is truly worthy of your service. Because, if we're not serving something worthy of our service, we'll be something unworthy. And in fact, you can say that's the prevailing question. The first half of life, what our task is to fit in and find our own path and develop enough ego strength to enter the world and begin to create a world for ourselves, create a life and relationships. But after that, then the real question is, and what's worthy of my service? And that's not necessarily what the ego had in mind, but it's, again, what the soul has in mind. That's quite a different story. So one thing I always have tried to do is to raise the sights of a client, for example, and say, what is it that gives you that sense of deepest purpose or engagement with life? And, trust that. That's serving your own nature. That's not narcissism or self-absorption. It's valuing what you have been given. And if you honor that, ultimately, it will be the person then you share with your family or with your society. So that's again, a service worthy of our best intents.
Is that also the source of something else that you talk about? You mentioned it earlier, this idea of Carl Jung's that we endure, that we must have the capacity to pick ourselves up off the floor, to emerge from a crash, to listen when something inside demands that we persist, even if the outer world has fallen apart, that is the source. Following this supports us. And I'm curious to know if this idea of feeling supported from the soul, feeling that we've listened and we're moving forward in our lives with a sense of purpose, does that arrive slowly? Does it evolve? Is it cultivated? Do we get an epiphany?
Well, it can be all of the above, I suppose. I am constructively haunted by Jung saying that we all have to find what supports us when nothing supports us. That's an open-ended inquiry, isn't it? All that we cherish is taken away from us, as happens to people in the course of life. What rises within you that is there for you? We're given by nature or divinity, whichever metaphor you prefer, a tensile strength, and we don't know it until life tests us, and we find that we have within us the resources not only of survival and legitimate adaptation, but something that is a kind of innate will that pulls us through something into the next stage of the journey. And it may not be the place you wanted to go, but it's the place that life has taken you. And therein is the space in which you are there to create your life as best you can. And sometimes people don't know this until they're put to the test. And that's when our dependency needs are most likely to show up. That's why I would say, whether it was midlife depression or later life medical crises, the first thought is, well, how quickly does this all go away? And I can sort of resume my normal life. Well, that may not be an option. The question is, how do you live your life productively and creatively and perhaps courageously in the face of that over which you may have no outer control? And that, again, brings a depth and a dignity to one's personal life. because as we grow older and so forth, we begin to lose our youthful powers, understandably. And how do you maintain the flickering of the spirit within that brings you back to the table of life? And, I would say two things very quickly. I consider one of my chief motives in my life at this moment is to be here as a partner for my wife, who is also aging and has had some health issues, so that she's not having to deal with so many things by herself to the degree that that's within my powers. And secondly, I'm still curious. There's so much more to learn. It's a marvelous time. You're talking about being overwhelmed with information. We are, but there's an awful lot to learn as well, you see. And it's a rich time for learning in all kinds of areas, architecture and the nature of the cosmos and so forth. These are things that, if there's an innate curiosity in a person, they're fully alive. That's the thing that most characterizes this animal species. It's curiosity. And with that, we are continuously opening a new world and a new chapter in our journey.
So, yes, there's something about curiosity that there's a buoyancy to it. And I think back on some of what Carl Jung wrote about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and also in the Red Book about reimagining the days when he was a boy and he was curious about everything and how he came alive just in reflecting on those times. And I think part of adult life is we bog ourselves down with worry instead of curiosity. I wonder, we're living in times that warrant some worry, but if there's anything that you could say about how to step forward and live buoyantly, what would it be?
Well, I think we want to include in this to learn more about yourself. And a lot of that necessarily won't be pretty. You realize that maybe this was coming out of a whole fear-based agenda or an old adaptation, but at least you've learned that. Otherwise, it's operating autonomously within your life. Many times in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung says, here's another thing I learned about myself, and it felt like a defeat for the ego. Well, why is it a defeat for the ego? Because the ego likes to fantasize that it's the boss and it's in charge, rather than being a servant to something larger that is seeking its expression in the world through the ego consciousness. So, but that's that humbling encounter, because this doesn't inflate you and make you superior in any way. It's actually humbling work, and yet there is this core recognition, this core curiosity. I've often said to people in therapy, for example, let's try to examine what happened back then and how you understood it then. What was its message to you? And where is the service to that message shown up in your life? Because it's bound to sooner or later in patterns of complicity or patterns of avoidance, for example. But then how do you see it today? And how would you reimagine that or reframe that, so that you're not just what happened to you? Many times people are understandably defined by their trauma. Well, it's what happened to us, it's not who we are. What defines us is the story that we walk away from after the fact. And many of our traumatic experiences occur in childhood for obvious reasons. We're at the mercy of the world around us. And yet you wouldn't turn your automobile over to a child. And yet maybe the decision you made last week on this important topic was like turning your automobile over to an 8-year-old, and the child's fearfulness or its need to fit in or be acceptable to someone is what prevailed. It's not a federal crime, but it is an unwitting undermining of your adult capacity to make different choices and to trust the resilience that is within you to get through that process. So that's the work of a lifetime. We never arrive. It's a continuing encounter with the mystery out there and the mystery inside of each of us. And that makes it all very interesting, very exciting. And I said to people, this is not about curing you because you're not a disease. It's an ongoing investigation. It's about making your life journey more interesting to you. Won't always be pleasant, but it will be interesting if you open your eyes and pay attention to it.
Trusting the resilience that's within you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking that with me today, James Hollis. And this has been no surprise, another profound interview with you. I want to thank you on behalf of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago for your depth, your wisdom, your many years of work, and for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Patricia. It's a privilege to be with you, and I thank you for your good work to make some of the insights of Jung available to more and more people. That's what the last 50 years of my life has been about, and so I'm grateful to be on the same team with you.